Center. In the conference room here, we have Lindsay Middleton and Brian Miller and myself. It's really a pleasure to have Laurie Young and Betsy Neely make the presentation, but note that this is a team effort for the Southwest Colorado project, looking at social-ecological resilience to climate change in that area. And as the title slide indicates, they'll be talking about engaging stakeholders and looking at how we move forward with in that endeavor. And this has really been a remarkable project and really bringing people together from these multiple disciplines, really looking at this integrated effort to look at adaptation efforts in this region. We'll have a sort of a tag team presentation today, starting with Laurie Young from University of Montana, followed with Betsy Neely from the Nature Conservancy. And so with that short introduction, I'll just turn it over to Laurie and have her give us the initial part of the presentation. And this will be recorded, and I think the recording's on, so we'll just go right ahead.
Thanks, Dennis. Well, Betsy and I are really excited to talk with you today about this project. And as you can see, it's a project with a lot of partners. It's a big and multifaceted project, and we're going to focus on a couple of aspects of it today rather than going into each of the sort of parts of the project in detail. Our project is focused on the San Juan and Gunnison basins in southwest Colorado. And we have a number of objectives, including understanding social and ecological vulnerabilities, creating tools and models that help with decision making, developing actionable adaptation strategies, identifying the institutional arrangements or policies that are needed to enable those, and then really kind of documenting what we've done and what's worked to enable other projects to adopt kind of our lessons learned and insights. We are looking at this project at really the intersection of ecological, climate, and social systems, and really trying to understand some of the key interactions between those, both in the research components and then moving those into building strategies. And this is our planning framework. You can see there's a lot of different activities that we've been engaged with over the last few years. Again, we're just going to focus on some of those today. We've engaged with managers in both of these landscapes in a lot of different ways. They have helped select the target landscapes, which have been the focus of the project throughout. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Helped us develop different kinds of models, participated in interviews and focus groups, and then finally, more recently, developed adaptation strategies. So they've really been a core part of the project throughout. The first step in our project was assessing ecological vulnerabilities in both of the basins. After that, we engaged with stakeholders to select target landscapes in both the Gunnison and the San Juan. In the Gunnison, stakeholders selected sagebrush and spruce-fir. In the San Juan, seeps and springs and pinyon juniper, and those were selected because they had both social and ecological importance in those areas. And then we built 3 climate scenarios 20 years out from now. And we picked that time frame because mid-century and end-of-century projections tend to be too far out for most decision makers who need something a little bit closer to, just a little bit sooner, essentially. After building those climate scenarios, our climatologists and ecologists basically downscaled them to produce real tangible sort of impacts or storylines of impacts for both the Gunnison and the San Juan. And these are what we call our narrative scenarios. They essentially try to understand how these 3 different climate scenarios will play out in these 2 different landscapes. And so what those folks did was really look at all the existing trend data that was relevant, as well as any kind of peer-reviewed literature and gray literature, and then really try to look at ecological processes and ecosystem features and how they would be affected under those scenarios. And you can see that they're called hot and dry, warm and wet, and feast and famine. And hot and dry and warm and wet, obviously, that's kind of intuitive to get the sense of what those scenarios are about. Feast or famine is a scenario that really outlines kind of interannual variability year to year, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. The purpose of these scenarios is to make those climate change impacts tangible at a landscape scale, but also to really communicate the range of plausible futures that folks in these landscapes might be encountering under climate change. Then we engaged in a series of social science activities to really kind of understand the use and importance of these target landscapes and how changes to these landscapes impact human communities, and also to understand different approaches to dealing with or managing for uncertainty. We employed a lot of different methods, including in-depth semi-structured one-on-one interviews, scenario-based focus groups and workshops where we took those narrative scenarios into working with groups of people and actually going through the scenarios and asking a series of questions about them. And then institutional interviews to better understand kind of the institutional barriers and enablers. The interviews and the focus groups and workshops were conducted with what we call adaptation actors, and these are individuals who have decision-making power, authority, that affects a landscape scale. So essentially we're talking about agency managers and folks who own large, private landowners with large plots of land, which in these landscapes is really ranchers. The institutional interviews occurred with people outside of these basins who are higher up in the agencies and could provide some perspective on kind of the broader institutional factors that affect adaptation. It was really interesting to see how people responded to the three scenarios. And what we found is that while hot and dry, which discussed more frequent, more intense, more prolonged drought, was seen as really hard and extremely challenging, as one respondent put it. But the feast and famine, the scenario with the interannual variability where you might have a few years of drought and then some years of flooding and then you kind of go back and forth in sort of unpredictable ways, that was oftentimes regarded as the most problematic scenario. And as this person put it, it's like bouncing around like a yo-yo. That interannual variability and unpredictability made it very difficult for people to plan. And the agencies also were concerned that it would be hard to communicate with the public about climate change in the absence of sort of a clear directional trend. And what's important about this finding is that there's a growing body of evidence that indicates that in the western U.S., climate change may produce an increased interannual variability, and so this may be exactly the scenario that we find ourselves living under. It was also really interesting to interview people and focus on those landscape targets that we talked about earlier: pinyon juniper, seeps and springs, sagebrush, and spruce-fir. And what was interesting is people really didn't want to talk about climate change writ large in particular landscapes. Instead, they wanted to talk about impacts or changes or threats to specific resources, especially water. Water was a critical resource in both of these landscapes, which probably doesn't surprise any of you, but also things like forage or timber, et cetera. And then rather than, again, talking about climate change writ large, they really focused on what we call climate proxies, or the specific kinds of changes that they associated with climate change or were expressed in the scenarios, things like changes to fire, beetles, invasives, or things like drought. And what we realized was there's a little bit of a disconnect between what the adaptation literature argues for, which is to sort of focus on these ecological targets, either ecosystems or ecological processes or even individual species of interest, and the ways that especially agency managers think about management action. Because managers are really focused on particular activities like managing for grazing, managing for recreation, managing for timber. And crosswalking that with managing for change in a particular ecosystem was a little bit difficult. And so we tried to think about how to bring those two together in terms of sort of how do you integrate adaptation strategies that are focused on ecological features with management focused on particular activities. was also really interesting to see how people responded to uncertainty as they were expressed by those scenarios. And we actually asked managers and ranchers how they would respond or how they might manage for a range of futures as expressed in the scenarios. And that was a really foreign idea. It wasn't something that people were accustomed to thinking about, kind of sort of plotting out actions that would be viable under this range of futures. And interestingly, there were a lot of ways in which people expressed a desire for more certainty. So for instance, people were very positive about the scenarios and felt like the scenarios were incredibly useful. They illustrated these tangible changes in their landscapes, and they also helped them understand the uncertainty. But at the end of the scenario exercises, people would oftentimes ask, okay, can you now tell me which one is the most likely? And they were sort of really had this desire for us to tell them, okay, which scenario are you going to actually get? And what we found also is that this level of uncertainty, and again, we're talking about uncertainty in the specific ways that these landscapes and ecosystems respond to climate change. Not uncertainty about whether climate change is happening, but the actual local changes. That this kind of uncertainty leads to what many agency personnel described as kind of a risk-averse, conservative decision-making culture, in which people were worried that they might not be able to justify their decisions given that uncertainty, and they might not be able to communicate them effectively to the public or get public support. So therefore, they would sort of retreat into safer spaces or safer kind of tried and true management actions, as opposed to engaging in the kind of innovation and experimentation that we might think is merited in the context of these changes that we're describing. And there were real mixed views on whether adaptive management could sort of tackle all of this. Some folks said, oh yeah, we can deal with uncertainty. You know, this is a lot of uncertainty, but we have adaptive management and we can use the adaptive management cycle. That's what we do. But a lot of folks felt like adaptive management was great in theory, but that the lack of monitoring data and the lack of institutional flexibility meant that when the rubber met the road, adaptive management practice didn't really live up to its expectations. And folks also talked about how adaptive management engages with uncertainty, but not the kind of deeper uncertainty as expressed by the scenarios. We also found a number of sort of barriers that folks articulated in terms of how they might respond to these sorts of climate change impacts. And some of them are pretty predictable, things like lack of funding for the agencies, insufficient monitoring data. There was also a lot of focus on the challenges presented by NEPA, and in particular, kind of the need for increased flexibility and nimble and responsive decision-making, and how to fit that into a NEPA framework or the NEPA requirements, which many people felt like required sort of at least an illusion of certainty, that you knew what was going to happen and that you understood the efficacy of your management actions so that you could actually justify taking those actions. We also found that there were some aspects of agency culture that presented some important barriers. And one was that across both of the basins, there were a lot of different definitions of adaptation. People were in very different places in terms of how they were thinking about adaptation and defining it, and many people really didn't know what adaptation was. And then, of course, the risk aversion that I talked about earlier, and then this sort of sense of inertia. These are big bureaucracies. It's hard to really change direction quickly, and how does that work in the context of this kind of flexibility and nimble decision-making that might be required? And also community barriers. These are mainly related to local politics or local conflicts, as well as the challenge of engaging a public that might be skeptical about anthropogenic climate change. But overall, we've got this sort of interesting interaction between a lot of different barriers, some of which are barriers that exist in all kinds of contexts, not just climate adaptation, as well as this sort of unique kind of level of uncertainty, and then also the potential for ecosystem transformation. And so this photograph, of course, is a great before and after photograph by Craig Allen of Opinion Juniper Landscape, trying to illustrate some of the sort of state changes that could occur under climate change. And that kind of transformation, we asked people very directly about that kind of transformation and whether they felt like they were prepared or their agency was prepared for that possibility. And for the most part, people said, no, we really don't know how we would respond or prepare for those kinds of bigger transformation or state changes. And so just to kind of sum up the social science piece, people had a lot of questions, and here are just some of them that kind of help summarize or outline their sort of where they are in terms of their thinking about climate adaptation in these particular landscapes. Folks wanted to know if they should think about climate change as really different from anything in the past, or if they should frame it as just another disturbance, and what would be the difference in terms of those framings, in terms of how they would engage the public as well as how they would move forward. They were wondering whether they should anticipate change or whether they should just wait and react to climate impacts when they could actually sort of see them, detect them in these landscapes. They, of course, were wondering what is adaptation really, even for folks who could sort of articulate an academic definition of climate change adaptation. They also wondered, what does this actually look like when we actually do it? And remember, this is sort of the earlier stages of the project before people have gone through those later steps that Betsy's going to outline in a few minutes. They wondered how to understand change and really make decisions in the context of the uncertainty articulated by those scenarios, and how to do adaptation in the context of these interacting barriers, institutional, agency culture, local community, and then how to effectively engage the public in this context, and we've talked about that a couple of times. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Betsy now, and she is going to pick up after the social science research and tell you what we did next.
Betsy, I just handed the presentation off to you. Let us know if you
Can you see the slides?
Yeah.
Great. Great.
No, we don't see your slides yet.
Oh, you don't?
No, we don't.
Oh. I'm sharing it.
Oh, okay. So
I just shared it. Let's see.
you have multiple monitors, sometimes that can complicate things.
Okay, let me put it up here. There we go.
There, now we see it.
Great, great. Sorry about that.
Okay, thanks.
Well, my name is Betsy Neely, and I'm with the Nature Conservancy State Office here in Boulder, Colorado. And my role in this project has been to lead the stakeholder process in the Gunnison Basin, while Marcy Bidwell of MSI and Renee Rondeau led the effort, a similar effort in the San Juan. And I've been working with the Gunnison Climate Working Group, which is a public-private partnership since 2009 to prepare for change. And we actually completed an ecological vulnerabilities assessment back in 2011. So we didn't do that as part of this project, but it really informed the overall project and our objectives. And what I'd like to do is talk about how we've engaged our partners in these other steps, including the ecological modeling, which was done, alongside with the social science work, and then developing these social ecological response models to identify impacts and interventions, and then the final prize, which is developing these social ecological strategies. And one thing you might notice that's missing on this framework is this monitoring and adjusting the strategies. And so we really do need to update that, the framework, but that is beyond the scope of this project. But I want to emphasize that just about every step of the way, we've involved stakeholders. And if you can imagine, it's been about 3 years. we really owe a lot to our stakeholders for sticking with us for this long. Renee Rondeau and other ecologists developed these ecological response models to help us better understand how the system works, so the reference models to begin with, and then to evaluate how potential climate impacts of our 3 climate scenarios affect the systems and the ecosystem states. So I won't get into the details, but you can just see this helps us identify what should we be most concerned with. And in this case, it's highlighted in the big red circle, is that our lower elevation sagebrush species are very likely to transform with disturbances, drought, and fire into these non-native grasslands dominated by cheatgrass. And so these models really helped us articulate what the major impacts that we should be concerned about for each of our systems. Now, I've got to hand it to Renee for trying to put this together, but this is terrific because what this slide shows you is the sagebrush landscape and how it would respond under all 3 of our climate scenarios. And you can see the HD is a hot and dry, FF is feast and famine, and warm and wet. And if you look at that low elevation sagebrush, which is our Wyoming sagebrush, you can see that under 2 of our 3 scenarios, it's likely to decline, die, and again turn into this grassland, which is probably largely dominated by the cheatgrass. But if you look in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the montane sagebrush under all 3 scenarios is likely to move up in elevation. So again, what this does is just help us understand the system and what some of the key impacts that we should be concerned with and do the rest of our planning with. So just to list just a few of them, for the sagebrush system, increased severity of drought, increased or proliferation of invasive species, particularly cheatgrass, dying back of the Wyoming sage, and an altered hydrologic regime. So that was a very useful exercise to go through. One thing we hadn't originally planned, but we worked with Jim Worrell, who's a researcher with the U.S. Forest Service, who'd been working with some of his colleagues, Ray Felt and others, to develop these bioclimatic models. And this is something that our partners really responded to. So we continued to work with Jim and others, the Natural Heritage Program, to further develop this concept. And Jim actually coined the terms lost and threatened, persistent, and emergent. And while this is for a little bit further out than what our planning exercise was for, this is this spatial ecological response model is for about 2060. But you can see that the dark red here is the lost zone where we would lose the Engelmann spruce. Then actually, well, you lose the suitability of the climate to support spruce. And then if you look at the blue there, that's our current alpine zone. And we're calling that the emergent zone where the spruce-fir would be moving up into over time. but this area doesn't currently support spruce, obviously, but it's moving in. But again, what this set of maps did for the project was really help our partners put their arms around, get their arms around these changes and visualize the changes on the landscape. So once we had these pieces, the ecological response models, the social science, the narrative scenarios, and we were ready to kick off our early adaptation workshops in early April. And we were ready then to pull everything together to develop what we called these social ecological response models. And essentially what we were trying to do was to confirm or identify these climate impacts across, well, in this case, we started with the feast and famine scenario, but and then identified interventions. But then ultimately the goal at our final workshops was to look across all of the scenarios. We used two different methods to look at the interactions between ecosystems and livelihoods. The first you've probably seen before. It's this situation analysis. The method has been used a lot in the open standards by the Conservation Measures Partnership, Nature Conservancy, World Wildlife Fund, others, many others are using this method. And really what this did is just to help us define the social and ecological context of this landscape. And in this case, we're looking at the sagebrush. The green being the key targeted landscape, and the red the climate impacts, and the other orange the other drivers. And this helped us kind of systematically think about where we could intervene, take some preliminary actions to reduce the increased non-native species such as cheatgrass. And one of the interactions that kept coming up was this managing cheatgrass on a basin-wide scale. So this was a useful exercise, and a number of our partners felt that it was, after applying this one and the next one, felt that it was important to do this one first to kind of set the stage, set the context, because it was broader. Thanks to Rudy Schuster and Nina from the USGS, we were pleased to have some scientists from back east come and facilitate us through a different method called Chain of Consequences. And this was developed by the Strategic Sciences Group at USGS, or DOI, and it had been used in the Gulf of Mexico for the oil spill and Hurricane Sandy to identify interventions, and they wanted to test it out in a climate change situation. And our partners really liked this. They responded to it. And I won't get into all the details, but it's another method to help us identify what are some interventions. And in this case, in the sagebrush landscape, to deal with drought, some interventions that they identified were to help retain the water in the system, because they were concerned about the loss of irrigation water, was to build snow fences and increase in-stream water rights. So this was a great opportunity for us to compare these different methods. And as you can imagine, we had a lot of information after these workshops. So we went back to the drawing board. We spent lots of time mulling over what all the information that we'd gathered, and so we applied those methods for the feast and famine scenario. We needed to evaluate how well the impacts and interventions applied to the other scenarios, and we didn't address all of them at our workshops due to time constraints. So this is just a simple slide to show you that we went through a lot to filter down these impacts and interventions to see which impacts are most likely to occur across all scenarios, and the same which interventions would work across those scenarios, and which interventions are most likely to work at a large landscape scale. So that was a real important step. We pretty much did that internally on the project team, but then we took it to our partners for feedback. So then we were ready for our final adaptation strategies in early 2016, and this was very exciting. We had a smaller workshop in February and a bigger one in April. And what I think was really great about this workshop is that we engaged our partners. You can see one of our Forest Service partners from the GMUG National Forest presenting the results of the strategies, and they did the same for the goals and objectives. And we worked with them weeks before the workshop so that they were clear. But what we did at these workshops was to really focus on 3 social ecological strategies that would be effective across all of the scenarios, and brainstormed challenges and opportunities that would help with successful implementation of the strategies. So before we dive into what those are, I just wanted to get us on the same page as to what we're talking about with adaptation. And this is an example from the Gunnison, and the early work was from a Wildlife Conservation Society Doris Duke fund of this project in the Gunnison. But essentially what we're talking about are management efforts that are designed to help nature and people prepare for and adjust to climate change and associated impacts. And what we've been working on for 5 years now is to build ecosystem resilience by restoring hydrologic function of these small wet meadows and riparian areas by using these simple rock structures to help a number of wildlife species as well as ranchers adapt to the changing climate and its associated impacts. So that, I think, we had an advantage in the Gunnison area because people have been working on this. They were committed to helping us develop actionable adaptation strategies. And so that was a good place to start. So all these workshops, all the work led up to 3 strategies that cross the 3 different climate scenarios: identify and protect refugia, proactive treatment for resilience, and assist and allow for transformation. In addition to accepting that transformation is taking place. But what was really great about these strategies, I think, and it helped with people understanding and embracing them, is that they can apply to these various bioclimatic zones that we showed earlier. And ultimately what we're really trying to do here is maintain the livelihoods and these functional landscapes so that we can ensure that our species and these communities continue to thrive in one way or another. We really don't have time to get into all the details, but I think that at first we had a little issue with people accepting the term refugia. I think we've come a long way there. And then I think the most number of interventions came up for this resilience strategy. People really got that. And then the transformation was more challenging because of the uncertainty that Laurie talked about. But coming up with strategies to help these landscapes over time is hard because, it's cutting-edge work, and there's a lot of research needed and a lot of testing that needs to go on there. But it was a hard conversation, but we needed to have it. I just wanted to show an example of another tool that we used. Again, it's been developed by Conservation Measures Partnership and used all over the world. But what I think was great about this results chain is that it helped us to systematically define what our strategies were, rather than just a bunch of people in the room, excuse me, I had a timer on, just brainstorming strategies and actions. This helped us be more disciplined. And I must admit, sometimes it was a little painful, but basically the strategy is in yellow, and then the blue boxes are these intermediate outcomes that need to happen to ensure that our desired outcomes in purple, which in this case for Spruce-Fir is a functioning and resilient landscape. It was hard work, and what this does not show are the actions underneath each of the intermediate outcomes. Those are in our report that we're working on now. So I wanted to just start wrapping up here and tell you just a few closing thoughts about the project. And we're still working on the final report and getting feedback from our partners. But we're very encouraged that there is early use of the strategies and products. I mean, early on, I'd say about a year ago, the Forest Service contacted us down on the Grand Mesa, Uncompahgre, and Gunnison National Forest, was working on a spruce beetle epidemic and aspen decline management response project, and they wanted a number of the Forest Service staff came to the meetings. They wanted the climate scenarios, they wanted the bioclimatic zones, and they continue to support us and say they're using those and have incorporated that. I haven't actually checked up on that, but I trust them. And the two other strategies and actions that came out of mostly the building resilience, the second strategy, is the concept of this climate smart seed mix, which is I think a lot of people embraced it. There are not policies in place yet to support it, but it's just this idea that we need to start thinking about the proportion of cool and warm season species in our seed mixes and maybe increase more warm season species. And our restoration project that's working in these wet meadows has actually been using some of what we came up with at the April workshop to reseed disturbed areas after we built some of our what's called plug and spread structures. In the case of cheatgrass, we've already talked about that. Our BLM partner is very excited about that in the county because we just cannot continue to manage cheatgrass, by one agency at a time. We need to be doing that kind of thing across boundaries. So those are just some of the highlights. And I think this integrated framework has really been terrific. We've all learned a lot. There were a lot of partners and PIs on the project. And I think it was our social scientists who said, we have to have these multiple scenarios. And it really has been terrific because it's helped us think about how we can address that uncertainty. And as you can see with this slide of our 3 different scenarios, we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And I think we've talked a lot about the feast and famine already, but it was because of the results of Katie Clifford interviewing the managers who told her, hey, this is really going to be the most challenging scenario due to the huge interannual variability, we decided to focus our first big climate adaptation workshop on that scenario, and then we moved to the other scenarios. And then Laurie already talked about the manager's perspective, but I think that's an important one too. It opened up the eyes of those of us that hadn't been working with social scientists before. So I think it was really a great experience. In closing, there's a lot of lessons learned here, but I think we realize that this transformation is the hardest for managers to embrace. And I think, we made good progress, but it needs a lot of more work, and certainly on the research and strategy side. And it was good to have some of the folks from the Forest Service Research Center station there, getting ideas and hopefully proposing new projects. Again, the bioclimatic models were embraced by our partners, and I know sometimes it might give you a false sense of what's going to happen, but the fact that we presented all of the various potential scenarios was very helpful. And then finally, this planning framework. I think what sets this project aside is that it really is a complete package. It's iterative, it's multidisciplinary, it's trying to integrate all the climate, social, and ecosystems. It's not a piecemeal approach. And we tested a lot of different methods along the way. I mean, the chain of consequences, situation analysis, and results chains. And we had good success, but I really think that it's important to consider the stakeholders' time, which is very valuable. And we did experience some stakeholder fatigue after this 3-year project. So we're wrapping it up soon, and we're not suggesting that all others replicate all of these steps in this framework, but there are bits and pieces that could be done, for example, on the state level. BLM working on ecological vulnerabilities at the regional or the state level. The ecological response models could be done so that others can pick and choose what they need to inform their process. So I think that was an important lesson learned in terms of developing strategy, that are a number of these different tools helped us come to very similar adaptation strategies in the end. And of course, I noted that there is a 1 or 2 boxes missing towards the end there, but it's a little beyond the scope of this project. But it's so important that we continue to monitor our progress towards our goals and objectives, and how effective our strategies are. And I just wanted to thank all of the partners who've been involved in this, and the North Central Climate Science Center for funding the project. And it's just really been a terrific experience, and we've learned a lot, and we're working on our final reports now, and we love reviewers. So thank you. That's all I have.
Thanks, Laurie and Betsy.
We're going to hand it back over to Laurie. She has a brief announcement. Laurie, okay, there you go. Yep, we got it. Thanks.
Great. So I just wanted to let everybody know about a webinar series that we are about to launch that looks in more depth at each of the steps of this project, and kind of tries to, what we're trying to do with this webinar series is really look at lessons learned through the process of each step, the vulnerability assessments, developing the scenarios, engaging stakeholders in different ways, et cetera, so that we can illustrate the ways that these tools can be used in other projects and other landscapes. And so I'll just scroll down real quickly, but you can, this information is on the Rocky Mountain Research Station, the Forest Service Document Research Station website. They're helping us host the webinar series. But you're welcome to contact me for more information. And Jill Lackett at the Climate Science Center is going to be forwarding all of the announcements to the Climate Science Center list for these webinars. And so you'll all be getting them. But if you don't get them, just feel free to contact me and I'll put you on the list. And with that, I think we can take any questions or have discussion.
Yeah, it's open mic. So I have a question for you all. It sounded like the effort that you put together in lessons learned actually is quite valuable. And wondering if, and I think I've heard this, that you're developing some sort of training module around some of the work that you've done. Is that developing, or do you know about that? Did I get that right?
Yeah, Dennis, I think you're probably talking about our session our proposed session at the National Adaptation Forum. And so we're trying to translate this into sort of a training session that looks at these different pieces that you can see up here with the webinar schedule and provides training for folks in different places on how to apply this process to other landscapes and issues, et cetera. So that'll be this spring. I think the National Adaptation Forum is in May, right?
That's correct.
And Betsy or Nina, I don't know if you want to add anything about that.
No, I think you covered it, Laurie.
Agreed.
In the sort of engagement and partnership with your stakeholders, what sort of innovation, I guess, from their perspectives, what were some of the things that you picked up as something that was, I guess, innovative to them and sort of was a threshold moment of seeing them really gaining, excited and engaged in this type of activity? Was there something that highlighted when sort of this light bulb went off and they really got engaged?
Well, I could add one. We were running through some of these methods, these flow charts, for several of our targets, and for sagebrush and for Spruce-Fir, and we had a number of our Gunnison Climate Working Group folks in the room, and we had finished the what we needed to accomplish, and they said, well, hey, let's stay and work through this process for the wet meadows. And I mean, that's not that it's that new or innovative, but it showed me that there was a lot of buy-in on the process, that they that they wanted to see it, how it worked out, because that was a real life example of a project that we'd been working on. So I liked that. It was gratifying.
It's Karina here, just chiming in. I think in the San Juan context, particularly the Forest Service workshop which we held, where we had, I can't remember, I sent you the numbers yesterday, Laurie, it was like 18 Forest Service people and maybe 10 or 12 ranchers come. And, there was a lot of concern in the lead up to holding those workshops that it was going to be about climate change and, politics of climate change, blah, blah, blah. But actually, the end of the day, I think a lot of that we use the scenarios as a way to have a conversation, like the whole kind of day was facilitated around discussing the impacts of those scenarios. And by the end of it, some of the ranchers and Forest Service staff were like, thank you for facilitating that conversation. We just haven't had a conversation like that. I think because the Forest Service was quite sort of a little bit gun-shy about having that kind of a conversation, but just bringing that group of people together, like we could have I don't know, I mean, maybe the scenarios facilitated that process. I think they did help us talk about climate change without talking about the politics of climate change, but it was more just giving people the space to have a conversation that they realized they needed to have.
And that's important. That's great. Any other comments or questions?
That was a recurring theme in our workshops. At the end of the workshops, typically there would be someone who would say, look, this is so important that we continue this conversation to think about the whole landscape across all these political boundaries. And there's a lot of concern about how they want to keep this up and keep up the momentum and, keep working across boundaries, because right now there really isn't an avenue or a structure for that. And that came up in our, definitely, again, in our final workshop when we talked about barriers to successful implementation.
So did they actually come up with some potential strategies? Were there champions in the community that would take that on? Or I guess what is the next steps and way of looking at these continued actions?
Good point. For us, what we heard, we didn't all, I mean, at the end we had hoped to have the highest level managers, and some of them dropped in, which was great, but most of our middle level managers that continuously came to the workshop said, we've got to get this out to the high level managers and talk through this, and so that's on our list of next steps once we get these reports all done and get back out there and think about implementation.
Right.
Just chiming in again, I think it's a really important question because, I mean, some of the conversations, it came up a lot in the San Juans as well, and, one of the wildlife biologists from one of the agencies, I can't remember which agency it was, had just, on his own initiative decided he was going to start a monthly wildlife biologist breakfast where he would get the biologists from the different agencies together and they would have these kinds of conversations. So, I mean, I think there are informal ways in which people are working together, but these types of research interventions actually provide a space to bring the agencies together when the agencies themselves aren't doing it. But finding ways, I mean, and I think this is particularly prevalent now with the changing political climate, to enable those kinds of conversations to keep going is a really, important area to keep thinking about.
Because to me it seems the challenging part is how you engage people in a continuous process, not that, because oftentimes people are looking for solutions, as Laurie was talking about, reducing uncertainty, looking at, predictability and, what are the framework of various steps that we need to take. Whereas to me, the real product of these type of activities is really being part of the process and continuing to be, maintaining that iterative, set of discussions and evaluating the type of management activities that you're putting on the ground, truly embracing adaptive management strategies and practices. And this is, to me, seems like a very strong effort in the initial stage of that, but it's more the maintenance of sustaining the process more than reflecting on what are the outcomes.
Well said.
Yeah, I mean, I've got other thoughts, but if there are other people on the call that want to speak before I open my big mouth again, I'm happy to listen. Okay, so it goes. I mean, I think, Dennis, you're totally right. I think, and part of the challenge is the way in which we go into places and frame how we talk about adaptation. You know, I think we go into places in the search for strategies that we will implement rather than going into these conversations to talk about adaptation as a process of learning to live with change. And if we think about adaptation as a process of learning to live with change, then it doesn't have an endpoint. And so the way that you think about what you do and how you design your interventions has to just include that learning component in there, which is part of like the point, Betsy, that you made prior, which I thought was excellent, in needing to make sure we keep going and monitoring whether or not these processes are working, understanding, like, as our understanding of the climate gets better, as our understanding of the kind of ecological responses to our interventions, the social impacts of them. You know, if you keep that learning frame front and center in the way we think about what adaptation is, then I think that shifts the kind of projectification of the process and the cycles of how we approach it.
So the challenge to you guys, as you think about your looking at your final report and how you actually evaluate next steps, is whether or not you have a set of metrics of resilience. Because to me, what you're describing, Karina, in a way of looking at the learning process and this process as part of that, one of the outcomes that really be valuable to be able to evaluate or assess is then, developing metrics that identify the ability or success of having that learning environment, that knowledge sharing, and how that relates to improved resilience. Because I think in all of this, that's there needs to be some sort of accountability in way of outcome that we can share with various decision makers, funders, that what we're doing is a useful endeavor and not just sort of a way of just doing something, just continuing to do something for the sake of doing it, but that there are measurable outcomes that we can identify.
Yeah, great question, definitely.
And it's one that I'm sure that we'll continue to ask ourselves with, but it's just something that, given the maturity and the type of activity that you've all done jointly, it seems like you guys are in a good position to actually maybe have some self-reflection on that. If we're coming up to the top of the hour, well, we're at the top of the hour now, and just a couple of quick maybe things, just to, announcements for you to be aware of. One thing that Shannon McNeely was pointing out today, and something we're trying to encourage all of our researchers to do, is actually get their the technical input for the National Climate Assessment is due on the 15th of this month, and we're trying to get, and I think you have a number of products here that, and some that be willing to put into this, some of the preliminary reports, some of the other findings, getting that listed into the technical input page of the National Climate Assessment really be very, very useful. Related to the National Climate Assessment, there's the Climate Science Special Report is out for comment, and that's on the USGCRP website, and it's really an outline or a framework document for the sustained assessment effort. So if you're able to look at that and provide comments, I do really appreciate that. Third is the USGCRP strategic plan. It's been revised. It's up now, open for comment as well. And I think, again, especially for you social scientists, really gain your input and your comments into them about how do we actually enhance the social ecological system thinking in the way that GCRP is moving forward, I think there's an opportunity to actually get the right wording in there. They're making a strong effort, but I think it takes persistent, continued input into those type of documents to really make sure they don't wander into their comfort zones and and steer away from the social ecological system, thinking that is an area where I think is very rewarding, but it's difficult for some of the biophysical scientists to really articulate well. And so you guys are really in the right position to help make sure that they stay on the right course. I don't have any other announcements. I just want to thank you all. This has been great. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks,
Great.
Laurie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Betsy.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.